Daddy, please marry her. I want her to stay forever.
Daddy, why don't you just marry her? I want her to stay forever. The billionaire nearly dropped his fork. His 7-year-old daughter was holding the hand of the poor nanny he had hired only months ago. What no one at that dinner table knew was that this simple request would soon expose secrets, destroy old enemies, and turn the poor nanny into the most important person in their lives. But to understand how that dinner table moment happened, you have to go back to the beginning, back to when everything fell apart. Richard Hartwell had built his empire from nothing. At 42, he owned 5 companies, 2 commercial buildings in the city center, and a reputation that made competitors nervous just hearing his name in a meeting room. He was the kind of man people pointed at from across hotel lobbies and whispered about. The kind of man magazine covers called unstoppable. But on a gray Wednesday morning, Richard sat alone in his enormous kitchen eating cold toast, staring at a divorce settlement document, and feeling like the most foolish man alive. His wife, Diana, had left him. Not quietly. Diana had announced the divorce at a dinner party in front of 11 guests, slid the papers across the table the following morning, and by the end of the week she was seen laughing on the arm of Marcus Cole, Richard's biggest business rival and the one man Richard had spent the last 3 years trying to outmaneuver. Someone had told Diana that Marcus was wealthier, more connected, headed somewhere bigger. Diana, who had expensive taste and limited patience, packed her things within a month and walked straight into Marcus's world without looking back. She left behind her wardrobe, her old friends, and her 7-year-old daughter. She left behind Sophie. Richard could absorb the public humiliation. He had survived harder things. What he could not absorb was watching Sophie unravel. Before the divorce, Sophie had been a joyful, loud, wonderfully exhausting child who collected snails in the garden and narrated everything she did in a running commentary directed at no one in particular. She had been the soundtrack of the house, constant, bright, impossible to ignore. After her mother left, Sophie went quiet in a way that was far worse than any tantrum. Then the anger came. It arrived slowly at first, in small, sharp moments. A plate pushed off the table, a door slammed hard enough to crack the frame. Then it grew. Sophie became difficult with the house staff, impossible with teachers, and completely unbearable with nannies. She seemed to have decided that everyone who entered her life would eventually leave, so she would make them leave first, on her terms, before they could hurt her. 7 nannies resigned in 4 months. The first said Sophie had cut the laces off all her shoes while she slept. The second found her work clothes stuffed behind the garden hedge. The third lasted 9 days and left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter that simply said, "I am sorry. I cannot do this." The 4th through 7th departed with varying degrees of tears and disbelief, each one telling the agency that the child was beyond managing. Richard was running out of options and running low on patience. He loved his daughter completely, and that love was currently being expressed mostly through exhaustion and quiet desperation. It was on a Thursday afternoon, standing outside St. Mary's Hospital trying to reach his assistant on the phone, that he saw her. She was sitting on the steps at the hospital entrance with her face in her hands, not making a scene, not drawing attention, just sitting there, completely still, crying in the specific way of someone who has simply run out of the energy to hold it together any longer. Richard almost walked past. He was a private person who valued other people's privacy and had places to be. But something about the stillness of her stopped him, the quiet dignity of it, even in obvious distress. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you all right?" She looked up. Her name was Clara Bennett. She was 26 years old, and she had just been dismissed from her job as a hospital administrator for missing 2 days of work. 2 days, because her grandmother had suffered a health episode at home, and there had been no one else to take her to hospital. Clara had called her supervisor, explained the situation, and been told her absence was noted. When she returned, her access card no longer worked and her personal items had been moved to a box near the front desk. Richard stood on the hospital steps and listened to all of this. He had a particular ability to read people. It was something that had served him well in business, and as he listened to Clara speak, calm and composed even with tears on her face, he recognized something in her that none of the 7 nannies had possessed, a kind of deep steadiness. the sort that did not come from comfort but from years of carrying weight without putting it down. He told her about Sophie. He was honest about it. He did not soften the picture or make the job sound easier than it was. He told her the child was 7 years old, recently wounded by her mother's departure, and that she had made 7 trained nannies quit in 4 months. Then he told her the salary, which was more than twice what Clara had been earning at the hospital. Clara said yes immediately. She had absolutely no choice. What Richard did not know, standing there on those hospital steps, was what Clara was actually carrying. 3 years earlier, her parents had been killed in a car accident that changed everything in a single night. They left behind Clara and her younger brother, Nathan, who was 16 and still in school. They left behind their grandmother, Margaret, who had a heart condition and medical bills that arrived every month like unwanted house guests. And they left behind a legacy. Clara's parents had once owned a fashion house, a well-known, respected one with a real name and real clients who traveled to see their collections. Beautiful, original designs. A business built on talent and years of hard work. But without either founder, the company had quietly closed, and everything her parents had built had slipped away before Clara was old enough to save it. Clara had inherited her mother's hands and her father's eye. She could look at a piece of fabric and see what it wanted to become. She filled notebooks with designs she sketched in quiet moments, drawings of the business she planned to rebuild one day. But survival kept that day at a distance. She took whatever work she could find, sent money home weekly, kept Nathan in school, and made sure Margaret's medical appointments were never missed. She moved into Richard's house on a Monday morning with 1 suitcase and very modest expectations. By Monday afternoon, Sophie had already handed her a list. It was written in red pen on 4 pages torn from a school notebook and covered in underlining. The rules included: do not move anything in my room. Do not speak to me before I speak to you. Do not laugh too loudly. And at the bottom of the final page, underlined 3 times, do not think you are staying. Clara read through every page carefully. Then she folded the list, put it in her pocket, and asked Sophie if she preferred her eggs scrambled or fried. Sophie stared at her the way you stare at something you cannot quite classify. Scrambled, she said, after a long pause. Scrambled, Clara confirmed, and turned to the stove. The weeks that followed were not easy. Sophie was relentless and creative in her campaign to make Clara's life difficult. She hid her keys. She gave deliberately wrong directions to every room in the house. She told Clara she smelled strange, that her hair was boring, that the other nannies had been better. She knocked a glass of juice off the counter one afternoon and watched Clara's face carefully to see what she would do. Clara wiped up the juice, rinsed the cloth, and asked Sophie if she wanted a snack. Sophie did not know what to do with someone who would not break. The shift happened quietly, the way all the most important changes do. Not in one dramatic moment, but in small ones, accumulating. It started with the sewing. One evening Clara had settled in the sitting room with a small sewing project, a simple blouse she was making for her grandmother, and Sophie appeared in the doorway, drawn by the movement of the needle and thread. She didn't speak. She just stood and watched. The following evening she sat in the armchair across the room. The evening after that she was on the sofa beside Clara, close enough to see the stitches. "Why do you choose that color?" she asked. "Because your grandmother would like it," Clara said, without stopping. "How do you know what she likes?" "I know her." Sophie thought about this for a moment. "Can you make something for me?" Clara made her a small embroidered pouch, deep blue with tiny white stars sewn around the edge. Sophie kept it on her bedside table and never mentioned it, but Clara noticed she moved it to her school bag the following Monday. Something in the little girl began to soften, slowly, like ice that doesn't know it's melting. She started eating at the table without being asked. She slept through the night. She began sharing small pieces of her day at dinner, a funny thing a classmate had said, a book she had started reading, an opinion she had formed about something and wanted to discuss at some length. The running commentary that had gone silent after her mother left began quietly, tentatively, returning. One afternoon a delivery driver spoke rudely to Clara at the front door over a misdelivered package. Sophie appeared beside Clara from nowhere, looked up at the man with complete composure, and said, apologized to her, please. This is her house." The driver apologized. Clara said nothing, but later, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, she pressed her hand briefly over her mouth and her eyes were bright. Richard began coming home earlier. He told himself it was because work had been lighter. He told himself many things. But the truth was simpler and he knew it. The house had changed. He would come through the front door and hear his daughter's voice, not crying, not screaming, but talking, laughing, having actual conversations, and something in his chest that had been clenched for months would loosen. He started noticing Clara in the way you notice things that have been in front of you for a while before you allow yourself to really look. He noticed how she spoke to Sophie, never condescending, never dismissive, always as though what the child said mattered and deserved a real response. He noticed the notebook she carried, the sketches visible when she left it open on the table. He noticed that she asked him how his day had been at dinner and listened to the whole answer instead of waiting for her turn to speak. He found excuses to extend her hours on weekends. He felt guilty about it and paid extra without discussing it. Their dinners grew longer. They talked about business, about architecture, about what kind of future Nathan might build if given the right opportunities. She made him laugh once, properly, unexpectedly, and he found himself thinking about that laugh at entirely inconvenient moments throughout the following week. He knew what was happening. He had been trying not to let it happen. The last time he had trusted his heart completely, he had ended up alone in a large house watching his daughter forget how to laugh. But then came that dinner. Sophie looked across the table at her father with the particular focused expression she wore when she had decided something and was done waiting to say it. "Daddy, why don't you just marry her? I want her to stay forever." Richard nearly dropped his fork. Clara went very still beside him. Sophie was holding Clara's hand on top of the table, completely unaware that she had just detonated something enormous, looking at her father with the patient expression of someone waiting for an obvious answer. Richard laughed, the slightly too loud laugh of a man who has been completely surprised and is buying himself time. "Sophie, I'm serious," Sophie said simply, and returned to her dinner as though the matter was settled. It wasn't settled, but it had been said, and said things have a way of growing louder the longer you try not to hear them. 3 weeks later, Richard asked Clara to dinner. Not a working meal, a real one, at a quiet restaurant where neither of them had history. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself from a deep green fabric she had found in a market. Richard told her she was the most elegant person in the room. She told him the dress had cost her $11 in fabric. He laughed so genuinely she decided then that she liked him. As their relationship grew, so did everything around it. Richard spent Sunday mornings with Nathan, talking, mentoring, asking questions and actually waiting for answers. Nathan was bright and funny and had been growing up without enough guidance. Richard moved him to a better school, sat with him over difficult homework, talked to him about what doors were worth opening and how to open them. Nathan began to thrive in the quiet, determined way of someone who has finally been given the right conditions. Margaret was transferred to a private facility where the doctors had time and equipment to treat her properly. Within 6 weeks, the woman who had been fading quietly was sitting upright, asking for better food, and demanding a full account of this man her granddaughter kept almost mentioning. One Saturday morning, a large wooden crate arrived at Clara's door. Inside was a professional sewing machine, the kind used by serious designers, and a card that said, in Richard's handwriting, "You've been waiting long enough. Start." Clara sat on the floor beside it for a long time. She started sewing again in the evenings after Sophie was in bed. A blouse first, then a dress, then a gown she made for one of Richard's colleagues who had admired her style at a small gathering. That colleague wore the gown to a charity event, and by the following morning 3 separate style publications had run photographs asking who had designed it. Clara built a website over a weekend. She registered the business under her parents' original name, the fashion house that had closed the night of the accident, and watched it come back to life like a window being opened in a room that had been shut for too long. Orders arrived slowly, then steadily, then in a rush that required her to hire help. She brought on 2 seamstresses, then 4, then found a proper studio. She was profiled in a national magazine, then a regional television segment, then a larger magazine, which put her work on the cover. But Diana had been watching all of this. Diana, who had left Richard for Marcus Cole and his supposedly superior empire, had been watching from a distance as her former life quietly became more beautiful without her in it. She watched her daughter laugh again. She watched the house she had abandoned become warm and full. And when she began hearing about Clara, the nanny, the fashion designer, the woman her own daughter had publicly asked her father to marry, something cold and ugly moved in her. She decided to act. She hired someone to dig through Clara's past. She was looking for something damaging, something scandalous, something she could use to publicly humiliate this woman who had walked into her old life and made it shine. She told herself it was about protecting Sophie. She told herself many things. What the investigation found was not what Diana expected. It found that Clara's parents had been the founders of a fashion house that had once dressed some of the most prominent people in the country. It found that Clara was the legal heir to that business name, its archives, and its intellectual property, a legacy that had been sitting dormant, waiting, worth considerably more than Diana had imagined. It found that the poor nanny Diana had intended to destroy was in fact quietly rebuilding one of the most respected names in the industry. Diana's plan to expose Clara's past did the opposite of what she intended. The story spread, but not as a scandal. It spread as something far more powerful. A true story of a young woman who had lost everything, held her family together through years of hardship, and rebuilt her parents' dream from nothing. Clients who read it ordered from Clara out of admiration. Journalists who covered it made her more famous. The attempt to ruin her became the engine of her rise. Marcus Cole, meanwhile, had been unraveling for some time. The wealth had been borrowed, the lifestyle was performance, and the cracks had been spreading quietly for over a year. By the time they became impossible to hide, Diana was already looking at a second divorce and an apartment she could barely afford, sitting alone with the specific grief of a person who had traded something real for something that turned out to be painted cardboard. She heard about the wedding from a mutual friend. She heard about Sophie in a dress sewn by Clara, walking between her father and her new mother with the satisfied expression of a child who had been right all along. She heard about Nathan, top of his class, already talking about university. She heard about Margaret, recovered and strong, sitting in the front row at the ceremony with her hands clasped and her eyes full. Diana had nothing to say. The man she had left had not fallen apart without her. He had simply waited, quietly, the way steady people wait, until someone came along who understood what the house had always been meant to feel like, and filled it accordingly. And Sophie, who had started all of this with one question at a dinner table, slept soundly that night in a home that was loud and warm and entirely, completely, permanently hers. The nanny came with one suitcase. She left as the heart of the family. Some people do not arrive in your life to pass through. They arrive to stay. And when they do, everything that was missing finally makes sense.